Hi guys, so today's chat is on the Sherman Firefly tank and its development, and a look at the Australian connection that was essential to its creation. The Firefly, or to use its other names Woodcock and Mayfly, came about during the Second World War as a desire to mount the 17-pounder anti-tank gun into a tank to increase the Armoured Corps' capability against German tanks, and it was not a tank destroyer or part of those projects. The UK had issued specifications for 17-pounder armed tank in early 1942, and one of the first tested was the A30 Challenger Mark I, using a modified Cromwell hull, which was ready by September of 1942, but due to uncertainty from the War Office on which guns to use on tanks, and some interference from the US, it wasn't accepted until early 1943. Meanwhile, the UK had begun to receive Shermans from the US, which were well liked and offered adequate firepower for most of the panzers they had come across, but would be inadequate against newer German designs such as the Tiger. Thus the idea to mount the 17-pounder onto the Sherman was raised. Two key men were involved early on. The first was Major George Brighty of the Royal Tank Regiment while he was stationed at Lulworth Armoured Fighting School in early 1943. Major Brighty felt that the gun would be better mounted on the Sherman hull over that of the Cromwell, and had not been happy at the early A30 trials. The second was Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge, who had been injured in North Africa when his M3 Grant was knocked out and retired from active service. After spending time in the US in January 1943 at Fort Knox, he was sold on the idea of the Sherman, and upon returning to the UK met up with Brighty to work on the project of mounting a 17-pounder gun on the Sherman in June 1943. However, neither officer could work out a good solution of how to mount the 17-pounder with the limited room inside the Sherman's turret, particularly around the recoil, which was some 40 inches. The first attempt was to mount the gun rigidly and test it on a rail mount with the recoil energy absorbed directly into the turret face. But this was far from desirable, as fixed guns like this take a high toll on the vehicle themselves, and it was felt undesirable. The project itself was nearly derailed when the Ministry of Supply, who were still in turmoil over what guns various tanks should have, and who should use them, felt that such a project was impossible, a sentiment shared by the Americans as well. The Ministry of Supply thus asked that work being done on the Firefly be stopped. However, Witheridge had enough connections inside the industry to influence the Director of the Royal Armoured Corps, Major General Raymond Briggs, as well as the Director General of Weapons and Instruments Production at the Ministry of Supply, Mr. Claude Gibb, and argued that it was still possible, but the project would need them to include members of the Department of Tank Design and require expert advice. This allowed them to take on expert engineers, and one such man was William Kilbourn. Kilbourn had originally been an engineer at Vickers, working on airships in 1914 under Wallis, and then moved over to tanks in 1922. In 1943 he received a phone call from the Ministry of Supply, who, despairing, called him to say they didn't think the 17-pounder would ever fit the Sherman's turret, and the US had said that such a notion was folly. That night he sat down with the plans, and the following morning phoned the Ministry of Supply back to say it could be done, and he would need a dedicated team to do so. Kilbourn was able to modify the 17-pounder's 40-inch recoil by redesigning the recoil system, using shorter recuperators on either side, allowing the ergonomics of the Sherman to be used to the best effect. Kilbourn was also credited with altering the gun cradle and the shape of the gun itself, as well as the choice to remove the radio into a new bustle, resulting in effectively a new gun that had to be custom built for the Firefly, which took place in October 1943, and the final testing was done in February 1944. Yet while this is all very grand and British, it's also missing some vital information, and that is the Australian connection to the Firefly's development. On the other side of the world, the Australians were having their own problems. They had seen the defeat of the British in France and desired their own armoured vehicles, yet knew that supplies from the British following Dunkirk were unlikely, and later with Japanese aggression becoming a real threat, it was going to be extremely unlikely that they would receive any meaningful supplies from any of their allies. So, in that redoubtable determination so characteristic of the nation, they resolved to design their own tanks and vehicles to face what seemed to be an inevitable assault by the Japanese, as well as to counter German tanks abroad. Although they had no previous experience in building tanks, they were able to acquire some UK and American samples early on, and sent an engineer over to the UK, a Colonel William Watson, in December 1940. Watson himself was a British officer who had been seconded to the Australians as a technical advisor in October 1940, and had been involved in the design of the Covenanter previously. A second engineer, Alan Chamberlain, was sent to the US to study the M3 tanks to gather what information he could. The Aussies did have the advantage of having a fairly decent railway industry and suitable foundries which produced good quality steel, which would be essential in any tank building enterprise. When these engineers returned, they set to designing a new cruiser tank. Yet unlike the British vehicles, the Australian concept clearly had both nations' influences in her, looking like a hybrid of the M3 Lee and the cruiser tanks of the time. Yet she was not thin-skinned like the cruisers, nor slow and sluggish like infantry tanks, having a good all-round balance of features. They decided to keep a modified version of the M3 suspension, and her armour was very respectable 50 to 65mm of well-angled cast steel plate, backed up with a 40mm or a 3-inch close support gun, which for its time was very good. The AC1 Sentinel, as it came to be known, had a 4-man crew, and although the engine proved problematic, they were able to fit 3 Cadillac V8 car engines into a clover formation to produce 330 horsepower for a top speed of 30 miles per hour. This whole process took 22 months from start to finish, and the tank was by all accounts a good vehicle. But where the Australians led the field was in foresight. They realised that while the gun itself was more than adequate from what they knew about German tanks at the time, this could quickly change, and that by building the vehicle with the ease of adaptability and a very large turret ring from the outset, they could easily update the vehicle to counter any new threats. The AC1 was ready in 1942, yet they immediately began working on upgunning and improving the vehicle, notably in firepower. At the forefront of this effort was Colonel Watson, who wanted to mount a 17-pounder onto the tank, even though at the time the British could not spare any for testing, as all available guns were being sent to North Africa, where they were effectively slapping Rommel's panzers back into the Shadowlands. They did, however, have the data and plans for the gun, and knew its limitations, particularly around recoil force and dimensions. The Australians had been working on putting 25-pounder guns into the AC1, to be known as AC1B. The first version tested had the recuperators below the gun as standard, but this would inevitably affect gun handling, and so the recuperators were placed above the gun and built into the mantlet. The testing of the 25-pounder had been done by July 1942, yet the Australians are also aware of the rapid increase in the development of German tanks, and while proposals to mount a 6-pounder were discussed, they also felt by the time they'd done this the Germans would have upgraded again, and thus it made more sense to leap straight to the 17-pounder gun, which at the time was the best Allied gun available, while the 25-pounder would be retained as an interim solution. As they were not going to be given any 17-pounders, they set about building their own, to the plans given. But before trying to mount it in a tank, they decided to test the recoil by fitting 2 25-pounders to fire simultaneously side by side to generate enough force for evaluation. The test showed that the system was able to handle the recoil energy, and so the Australians now set to building a turret and fitting a 17-pounder gun in it. This was done and proven successfully in November 1942 at Fort Gellibrand, Victoria. The new 17-pounder tank would have been called AC4. However, the platform tested on was not actually an AC4 hull, and was an older model with temporary fittings to test the idea. Colonel Watson's secondment as a British officer to Australia ended in late 1942, and he was then flown back to England, where he met with Claude Gibb, who ironically was in fact an Australian by birth, and was now the Director General of Armoured Fighting Vehicles. Gibb inquired as to whether the Australians had been able to achieve the mounting of a 17-pounder, and Major Watson was able to confirm that they had done so in 1942, and supplied the drawings and schematics to Mr. Gibb, who had received a lot of criticism from the Ministry of Supply, who said that it was impractical if not impossible to do so. Gibbs was able to explain to the detractors that not only was it possible, but that it should be doable in England, and Colonel Watson was able to meet with those who were involved in the efforts and show them the changes they had made and how they'd gone about it. With this new information, the British were, along with Kilbourn, able to begin making the first Sherman Firefly. Claude Gibb would be recognised for his work, with Sir Winston Churchill acknowledging Gibb's contribution to the ultimate success of the battle, while Brighty and Witheridge would be paged into the history books. Yet Watson and his essential contribution seems to have been erased for common history. Yet without him, the Firefly would not have been ready in time for Normandy, or made the contribution it did. And before we go, one more interesting connection was the name of the Firefly, which is often attributed to the flash of the gun. Yet the names Mayfly and Woodcock also pop up as names for the Firefly, and there may be more to this. As we mentioned, William Kilbourn originally started his career at Vickers working on Rigid Airship No. 9R, the second Vickers giant airship. Their first large airship, the largest of its time, was nicknamed Mayfly, but she broke her back in strong wind, and the wreckage was often visited by Kilbourn during his work. The second name may be attributed to H.L. Woodcock, who was a pilot for many of the dirigibles of the time, and was involved in the Mayfly project, as well as being friends to both Kilbourn and Barnes Wallis, and later the Inspector Commander of dirigible airships. Well guys, I hope you liked the info and found something new. Let us know below, like and subscribe, and until next time, toodle pip.